Hey there, Mr. Terry, your high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher X video. All right, yesterday I checked out my first video from Agent Flappy. He's only been around for a couple months, but the videos have basically gone viral since he started. And with the first video that I watched yesterday, that was about president deaths. And I wanted to check out more. This one's called The Worst Presidents in American History. All right, this is one of those topics that you're going to see different people have different presidents appear on a list like this. I've actually covered some of them from like political pundits and things like that. So I'm interested to see what this has. Make sure to check out my new channel called Mr. Terry Originals. It's quickly filling up with all kinds of fun history content. Give it a shot. I think you'll like it. Link is down below. All right, this original video is also linked down below. Let's get Agent Flappy some more subs. All right, here we go. All right, so this is my, America hat, compliments of the fat electrician. Let's see what we got.
Chasing down runaway slaves, to stealing millions from wounded veterans, to doing nothing while the country burned to the ground. These are the 10 worst presidents in American history.
The pre-Civil War presidents.
And they're so bad, even I could do a better job. But first is Benjamin Harrison, who isn't exactly a household name.
Just for dying.
In fact, if you showed his face to 100 Americans, most would say, "Isn't that the guy from the Titanic?"
Oh, he does look like him.
Actually made a huge
That guy
mark,
died too.
mainly by wrecking the economy and then vanishing before he could take the blame. Because in 1890, Harrison signed the McKinley Tariff, jacking up tariffs to nearly 50%. The idea was to protect American businesses. But what actually happened was prices skyrocketed. Foreign trade collapsed, and farmers got absolutely smoked.
Now, this was an interesting precedent because a similar strategy was employed during the Great Depression. Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act jacked up tariffs, which again are taxes on imported goods, and it caused a global trade decrease that many economists believe made the Great Depression worse. Now, the sort of positive precedent that usually is referred to when talking about tariffs was in the very, very infancy of our country when we were still building it up. It was basically pre-industrial or very proto-industrial at that point. I mean, with some of that, we're still talking like late 1700s. To sort of build up a little bit of economic independence rather than be completely dependent on foreign dependence in its infant years, because that becomes a sort of situation that you can rarely get out of. You know, a country that comes to mind like that went pretty much immediately into, importing goods when it became independent was Argentina. Argentina, a very resource-rich place. United States was too, but still was importing so many things. And it became kind of a reliance, and then it stifled industrial growth. In a place where, although there's a lot of elements that go to industrialization, could have had, maybe more of like an industrial revolution of its own. And I know already a bunch of you are probably talking about the discussion and use of tariffs right now, and usually with similar goals as you're seeing even back here from like Harris administration. So how much do you think that is relevant precedent to look at some of the times, I guess, where it's seemingly been like positive, but then also the times that it's had a negative effect?
Foreign trade collapsed, and farmers got absolutely smoked. And as if that wasn't enough, he burned through the entire...
What he means by that is... What can happen with that is one of the things the United States can do a lot of is export food. We have an incredibly fertile country where we can export important food products. And if global trade goes down, then farmers can be hurt by that because they can get a lot of money by exporting food.
Absolutely smoked. And as if that wasn't enough, he burned through the entire federal surplus like a kid after his first paycheck. But the worst part? None of this came crashing down until after he left office. When the Panic of 1893 devastated the economy and President Grover Cleveland was left dealing with the dumpster fire. No fair! But Harrison, he was long gone.
By the way, this becomes an easy political tool when, you have something that the president before you can sort of be blamed with, or, it's very easy for you to blame with. It gets you in office. The issue, I guess, that comes after with is you better fix it, right? Otherwise, you're going to be gone.
No fair. But Harrison, he was long gone, chilling back in Indiana, writing books and pretending like nothing happened. So no, Benjamin Harrison didn't commit crimes or start wars. He just played Jenga with the economy and walked away as it collapsed. But none of that was as bad as Millard Fillmore, who turned every citizen into a slave hunter. Because in 1850, the nation was divided over slavery. The South was loving it. The North, not so much. But the South was threatening to secede. So in an effort to compromise and preserve the Union, Fillmore signed the Fugitive Slave Act, legally requiring every U.S. citizen to assist in the capture of runaway slaves. In other words, if a slave showed up on your doorstep and you offered them a glass of water, it could land you in prison.
Right, there became precedent for that because it actually even went to the Supreme Court. So with the Dred Scott decision, you had this, slave, Dred Scott, who then moves into a free state, as it was called, but was still seen as property and still seen as a slave, could not become a citizen, even though he had gone from a slave state to a sort of free state, which again, you were setting that precedent that, just because you walk into a slave state doesn't mean somebody that has been enslaved can not be a slave anymore.
Even if you lived in a free state. That's nuts. But as you may have guessed, this backfired. Because normal people who never cared about slavery were suddenly like, wait, what the is going on? With abolitionists.
So with that idea, it's like slavery could spread. You know what I mean? Now, if you were an abolitionist and you're actually somebody that was motivated with your opinions on slavery based on just like the inherent nature of slavery, because there's also those that were, concerned. Maybe their biggest concern was the whole fact that with the compromise, the 3/5 compromise in the Constitution, that slaves can still, even though it's 3/5, could be considered part of population for getting representatives, in Congress. Also, this would have made the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional as well. So really just kind of complicated things. When interestingly, I guess it was meant to not do that.
Movements growing overnight and more normies becoming radicalized by the day. So while Fillmore thought he was keeping the peace, he ended up pouring fuel on the fire.
That's a good way to
pushing the nation one step closer towards civil war. But that's not as embarrassing as this next president, William Henry Harrison, who holds the record for the shortest presidency in American history.
He dies
because in 1841, Harrison was 68 years old, one of the oldest presidents elected at the time. So, to prove he still had energy for the job, he delivered the longest inauguration speech ever recorded, nearly 2 hours long. Man's out here with no coat,
Gonna
no
get
hat,
sick.
and no common sense. The old man just wanted to prove he still had it. A lot like your grandpa trying to do a kickflip on your skateboard.
Yeah.
But a few weeks later, he came down with a bad cold that turned into pneumonia. For most of history, we thought it came from his crazy speech in the rain. But modern historians believe it was more likely
we talked about this in the other video.
Contaminated drinking water at the White House.
Right.
Either way, 31 days after taking office,
in the previous video.
William Henry Harrison was dead. He didn't sign a single law or make one decision. Instead, he spent more time writing an inauguration speech than being an actual president.
Thing is, though, like I would consider if we are talking about like worst presidents, don't you think it needs to be more about like their actions as a president? I mean, when you're in there for like a month and they don't really point to any significant lasting effects that way. It's like, could you put him on a worst presidents list? What do you guys think of that? I mean, he was worst at being alive as a president.
And to make matters worse, he triggered a constitutional crisis. Because at the time, nobody knew what happens after a president dies in office. It wasn't 100% clear if the vice president simply acted as president or became president outright. Thankfully, John Tyler stepped up and said, "I'm president now." And everyone just kind of went along with it.
Because there was this period in history where the vice president was just not like a person you'd consider as a person you talked about. And I'm not just talking about in like the earliest of years when the runner up would become president, but yeah, like you didn't really have a lot of power. Okay. You're going to be like tie breaking votes in the Senate and stuff like that. That does come about, especially in modern times. You see that happen. But I think once maybe people can realize that, if our presidents are going to be vulnerable to health issues and dying or assassinations, then yeah, it does kind of matter who the vice president is. Although I would still say it's going to be longer after this till the vice president is really considered with the power, respect, and authority that we probably see them today.
But what was William Henry Harrison's legacy? No scandals, no war, no nothing.
No time to.
Just one epic speech and a short stay at the White House.
The speech was so good
If there were a Hall of
him.
Fame for how to completely blow a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, Harrison would be a first-ballot member. But at least he didn't, completely destroy America, like Franklin Pierce, who, came pretty dang close. 'Cause with his movie star good looks and smooth-talking speeches, Pierce became elected to deal with the whole slavery problem.
I feel like just every president within 20 years of the Civil War usually makes its way on these lists. And the question, I guess, would be if you put it in the context of those people at that time, right? You have this country that is, again, very divided. What makes it, of course, even more complicated is the expansion of the United States. It keeps us expanding west. And these new territories are going to bring in new states, more people are going to move to them, which can, really affect the future of the country because, what are the politics going to be of these places? What's going to happen with slavery? And these presidents were just trying to, keep the country from collapsing in on itself by, again, making these things that are supposed to be seen as compromises. So what do you think the answer was then to actually push the issue forward, thus maybe pushing the Civil War forward if it was to come to that? What things, for example, do you think a president in the 1840s and into the 1850s could have done to address, the slave issue? And specifically, could it have been done without a civil war? What do you guys think about that? Let me know down below.
But he quickly made one giant mistake. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854.
Bleeding Kansas.
You see, back then there was a bunch of
Summoning Mr.
unorganized
Beat.
land after the Louisiana Purchase. State lines were still being drawn, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act established the areas as U.S. territories. But it also stated that popular sovereignty would determine if slavery was allowed in each territory.
So what that means, if you don't know, is the people there get to vote. That was another thing that was seen as a fair compromise for political leaders, is since they don't, have to have the pressure of deciding what to do about these new states. Because remember, up until the Louisiana Purchase, there's going to be an even balance, of slave states and free states. And then as compromises went on throughout the 1800s, they kind of kept doing the same thing, like with the Missouri Compromise. So the idea of, okay, let's put it to a vote of the people there. What that ended up bringing was zealots to these places coming from different parts of the country. You got your abolitionists, your pro-slavery people, whatever, and your most zealous ones that you can find are all going to be flooding in there, and they're going to take it very, very serious and are going to try to influence votes. And as you know, with this, if about to get into it, it also gets violent.
In other words, the new settlers would vote on it, reversing the long-standing Missouri Compromise, which banned it above a certain line. So, what was the result?
The Dred Scott decision really undermined it as well.
Anti-slavery forces flooded Kansas with rifles, torches, and angry mobs. The territory quickly descended into chaos and bloodshed. Houses were burned, families slaughtered, and the 5-year bloodbath was nicknamed Bleeding Kansas.
Yeah. You all remember that from your U.S. history classes?
Do to stop it? Pretty much nothing. In fact, he backed the pro-slavery side, which formed an illegitimate government through voter fraud and violence. He even sent in federal troops to stabilize the new government. Pretty crazy times. Because instead of calming tensions between the North and South, Pierce accelerated the nation's march towards civil war. But this next terrible president...
So what do you think about that? You kind of frame him, frame Pierce that way? You feel he had a large role in, I guess, enabling the violence in Kansas there? Do you think that's an accurate framing there? All right, well, we got Woodrow.
Is one you might not expect, and that's Woodrow Wilson.
You expected if you have been consuming a lot of content, I think, doing with with U.S. history, especially I would say in the last 10 years, I would say, is when the Wilson hate really was picking up. We'll be going back to like 15 years.
Who's known for his lofty ideals like championing the League of Nations and making the world safe for democracy. And hey, he did some pretty good stuff.
I don't know how much you can put on with that. I mean, some things are going to go into the League of Nations, but famously, a lot of things did not or were enforced unequally across the winning parties and sort of losing parties of the war.
The world's safe for democracy. And hey, he did some pretty good stuff, like lead us through World War I. But here's the problem. Back at home, he levied some of the worst attacks on American freedoms in U.S. history. During World War I, he signed the Espionage Act and Sedition Act, making it a crime to criticize the government, the military, or even the flag.
Yeah. Some of these precedents of doing things like this during wartime were also not new. It also happened, in the Civil War, in the American Civil War, suspending of habeas corpus, like with President Lincoln. And then we're going to see it, continue on with every major war, with World War II, and then in Vietnam, where there's just a lot of things when it comes to privacy, criticism, that you'll see legislation passed, but you probably would not in peacetime, which kind of brings in a debate that gets interesting to talk about, our classes, is that our war times, different type of situations where you almost have to, change. I don't know. If you want to call it freedoms or protections or whatever. Most recently, in the last couple decades, the Patriot Act, heavily criticized, right? Where someone that can, be like a suspect for terrorism can be investigated in a way that doesn't, follow the normal protocol of having warrants and, again, all those sort of things. So do you think wartime constitutes certain, I guess, suspensions of liberty to be able to make the war effort successful? What do you think?
Making it a crime to criticize the government, the military, or even the flag.
There was, as every war, anti-war
I love America
people.
Just as much as the next guy. I'm a friggin' bald eagle. But this was downright crazy. Because under his administration, over 2,000 Americans were prosecuted, like journalists, union leaders, and everyday citizens who dared to speak their minds.
One of the famous people that was convicted under the Sedition Act was Eugene Debs, who's probably the most famous socialist in America and was a repeated presidential candidate that took significant chunks of votes. And also famously, if you know about him, in 1920, he ran for president while from prison, where he got about 3.5%, I believe, of the vote.
Free speech, the bedrock of American democracy, was crushed under the weight of wartime paranoia. But Wilson thought it was totally worth it. Because after World War I, he pushed for the League of Nations, the first worldwide intergovernmental organization designed to maintain world peace. But there was one little problem. It was rejected by the U.S. Senate, out of fear that it would drag America into European wars.
Yep. Yeah, World War I did not have the effect on Americans who were like, yeah, let's keep getting involved in Europe. That was not the situation before, and it really wasn't American foreign policy. You had Monroe Doctrine, who basically said the Americans are going to stick to, the Western Hemisphere, basically, and Europe should stay out of, that. But this obviously changed things. But again, then even after the war, Americans were definitely, I think, further reminded, okay, get rid of American involvement in these types of wars. Remember, it took years, for the United States to get into World War I. It took a series of events. And even though the war started in 1914, the U.S. is not going to start getting involved until 1917 and really get kind of boots in the ground in 1918, which is going to be the last full year of the war.
He couldn't believe it. But here's the funny part. The League of Nations still ended up happening with 63 other countries, just without the U.S. So Wilson was left crying outside the club.
Is it worth talking about? If the United States had joined the League of Nations, do you think it would have had more power? Specifically, more power that may have averted the Second World War? Would have been able to do something more about what happens with, like, Italy's invasion of Ethiopia which was one of kind of the early big tests of the League of Nations, which pretty much found itself powerless to actually enforce stuff other than, hoping everyone agrees to sanctions. Could it have done something more about the other parts of the Treaty of Versailles that Germany is going to break with things like rearmaments, go to the Rhineland? What do you think about that? Or was it doomed no matter what?
And to cap it all off, he punished Germany so severely after World War I with the Treaty of Versailles that it sowed the seeds for World War II.
Well, the real hard pushing of that was definitely going to come from France and Britain. They came really harsh on it.
In the end, Wilson became a prisoner of his own ego. A man so obsessed with his vision, he refused to bend, causing chaos at home and abroad.
Wonder if they're going to talk about the
presidency had some eerily similar parallels to this next guy.
Okay, so I guess not. The other thing that actually to be honest, gets talked about more probably than all of the things that was discussed already in the video was basically pro-segregation policies in a lot of institutions in the United States, like basically resegregating the government. Talked about how there's like a kind of like a revival of the KKK in this era, where it had really kind of dropped up to this time. That's what I usually hear the most. All right, next up.
George W. Bush, who entered the White House with a handshake and a smirk, until history threw him every disaster
9/11.
Short of a meteor strike. First, 9/11. And to his credit, Bush brought the whole country together for about 6 months.
No, I would say it's longer than that. After 9/11, approval rating was very high. And even amongst civilians that are going to support what the next military actions are going to be, going into Iraq and Afghanistan, I think a lot of people forget how many people were supportive of that. Now, it was based on information that comes out later to be very faulty. And that's where Bush is seen a lot more negatively after his presidency than at the time. Although towards the end, because he's going to also win re-election, he's also able to do that by, saying that, these military interventions that are going on are keeping America safe. There was a big sense of vulnerability that came with the 9/11 attacks. And he was first elected in 2000. So in 2004, that stuff was still very fresh. It's going to be another, 6 years before they get Osama bin Laden. In Iraq, Saddam Hussein was collapsed, but there was this huge aftermath of instability and violence inside of Iraq. And then as the years went on, talking about, fact checking things about weapons of mass destruction or harboring terrorist groups, and so much of that, turned out to be false. But yeah, posthumously looked at far more negatively than the first half of his presidency.
But what followed reshaped the entire world, pretty much for the worse. First came the decision to invade Iraq, based on bad intelligence that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. Turns out, he didn't.
And it didn't even really matter necessarily that, Iraq, Saddam Hussein, had nothing to do with 9/11. It became this, if you live through this, depending on how, young or old you are, you might remember this idea of like the war on terror, that the response to 9/11 wasn't just going to be, okay, let's go hunt down Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda and those that were responsible for it, but anywhere that looks like they're supporting terrorist or, dare I say, even like, I guess, violent activities. Now, there's plenty of precedent with this. I mean, George W. Bush's father George H.W. Bush, or George Bush Sr., had been fighting in the first Gulf War, which did not take out Saddam Hussein's regime, but simply just, drove them from Kuwait. And then the whole axis of evil, speech and framing that it's basically, these two sides of the world and you're on one side or the other, right? So if you're not with the U.S., you're basically, sort of against. And there were plenty that were against.
But by then, the U.S. was locked into a $1 trillion war that cost over 4,400 American lives, wounded tens of thousands more, and destabilized the Middle East for decades.
You're talking hundreds of thousands of people dying in that actual region that's even just shown here in the map, and displacing millions of people.
Thanks for your service. But like Woodrow Wilson, Bush gutted the civil liberties of Americans at home
Patriot Act.
by passing the Patriot Act in October of 2001, which dramatically expanded
literally the month
powers
after
of the federal government, allowing the NSA and FBI to surveil U.S. citizens without a warrant.
So basically they're like, okay, and the context, this was also important. I remember the arguments on TV and stuff. The whole thing was, well, if you're not doing bad things, then you have nothing to fear. That became, honestly, the mantra of those that supported the Patriot Act at that time. And it's within the context of the vulnerability that people had felt. If, this is in October. The attack was a month before this, right? So people didn't know, are there bigger plots out there, and how close to are they to, fruition, right? In this next month or two, you go to high school football games and they're going to be surrounded by police officers because everybody felt a real threat that some kind of, terrorist activity was going to happen in, suburban, pick your state, you know what I mean, at the high school football game. That's why I was saying earlier, things like this usually only pass during war times and times of crisis.
Hey, is this thing recording me? So, although you can argue this was necessary at the time, many of these powers still exist today.
Yep, brings up the debate.
I don't think these guys would be too happy about a surveillance
protections
state.
during wartime or
then
not.
Came Hurricane Katrina, where the levees broke, New Orleans flooded, and the federal government's response was, we're working on it.
Very critical.
Because as people were left stranded on rooftops, the government set up the Louisiana Superdome as the shelter of last resort. But when 30,000 people showed up, it turned out to be a nightmare. The roof was damaged, the power failed, and toilets overflowed, which just stinks. The whole fiasco reeked of government inefficiency, and Bush was the poster child.
For sure.
So not only was Bush messing things up back then,
that's towards the end
but
of the
Americans
presidency,
are still living with the consequences today.
Such interesting bookmarks of the W. Bush presidency with, 9/11 and then with Katrina. And this really doomed the Republican Party for this next election. Could have John McCain coming in as a Republican. Of course, Barack Obama is going to come in, for the Democratic Party. And it did kind of seem like one of those scenarios where it really didn't matter who the Democratic Party put up. That does happen a lot in, in elections, because of the whole pendulum of American politics is always going to be like that.
But speaking of messing stuff up, after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, America needed a steady hand to unite the country.
Johnson?
Instead, it got Andrew Johnson, a former slaveholder from Tennessee who, believe it or not, didn't exactly believe in racial equality.
Sure. I mean, Lincoln was saying the same things. You go back to the Lincoln Douglas debates back for Illinois. Johnson was also a very political appointee, almost like a DEI, I guess, appointee, as he was a Southerner, but was with Abraham Lincoln to hope, maybe score some points in a place like Tennessee, which are these, kind of swing states, especially in that era. And, of course, can still be like that now.
He vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which would grant citizenship and basic rights to formerly enslaved people. Things like the right to make contracts, own property, and be treated equally under the law.
It'll be coming.
What the heck, man? But Congress wasn't having it. They overrode his veto and pushed through the 14th Amendment, locking those rights into the Constitution. But Johnson didn't back down. He found other ways to prop up the South, like issuing mass pardons to tens of thousands of Confederates.
That's been an interesting thing to talk about. That doesn't get talked about much is just the pardoning of Confederate leaders, right? So you have this huge secession and these, leaders that would be seen, by the North as traitors. They're secessionists. But yeah, totally pardoned from it. The argument was basically that this would, if they really did maybe even do like called a war crime trial or whatever it is, that this would hurt the, I guess, healing process of the United States after the Civil War, that they kind of had to move past it, I guess, as quickly as possible. Do you believe that was, the right thing to do? Again, if there were these extensive military tribunals after, do you think that would have helped or hurt the country going forward? What do you guys think about that? What should have happened?
Because it's kind of a big deal when you take up arms against the United States. Most governments would throw you in jail or hang you for treason. But Johnson restored their rights and let them retake power in the South. His logic? We shouldn't kick the losers while they're down. But as you might have guessed, his plan backfired.
So Colonel Sanders.
Because this started the Jim Crow era, created fertile ground for the Ku Klux Klan, and stoked racial tensions nationwide. In Congress's eyes, Johnson had basically undone the point of winning the whole Civil War. So they impeached him. The first presidential impeachment in U.S. history.
Won't be removed from office,
where Johnson faced trial in the Senate and survived conviction by just one vote. Phew, that was close. As you can tell, post-Civil War America was crazy. We needed a leader to rise above the hate and pull the country forward. Instead, Johnson doubled down on division. But if you thought that was bad...
So do you guys... How much of the blame do you put on Lincoln for basically putting him in this position? Do you guys think that should be part of the case? Like, this is something that Lincoln should have known, but again, kind of just placing him in that position for those political reasons for, winning re-election. Do you think Lincoln's legacy should also be connected to Johnson's?
Get ready for Herbert Hoover, who promised Americans a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage.
The Depression?
And honestly, people believed him. Because on paper, Hoover had a glittering resume.
He was the
self-made millionaire, humanitarian,
he was the money guy,
and a respected public servant. This guy was going to usher America into a new golden age. Until the Great Depression hit. Just months into his term, the stock market crashed and Hoover froze.
One of those things, again, the stock market crash was not the cause of the Depression. It definitely, triggered its growth and exposed the biggest flaws because this happens at 29 and the height of the Depression is in 32. It's a good, 3 years or so later. But the conditions definitely have been building up through the 20s, this false financial bubble that has been building, really since the end of the First World War, and that was not going to be sustainable.
As a staunch capitalist, he believed the government intervention would only make things worse. So he sat back and let private charities and local governments handle the crisis. The results? Banks collapsed.
Presidents post
Businesses
Wilson
shuttered, and unemployment soared to 25%. I'm going broke out here, man. But the final blow came in 1932.
Those unemployment rates also really disproportionately affected certain groups because you're still talking about a segregated era where some of the economic opportunities are not very good. For example, African Americans, that could push up to like 50%.
I'm going broke out here, man. But the final blow came in 1932 with the Bonus Army protest, where 15,000 World War I veterans marched peacefully on Washington, D.C., demanding early payment of bonuses they were promised, money they desperately needed to survive. And Hoover's response?
We don't have
he
any.
sent in the U.S. Army.
And we don't have any.
Led by General Douglas MacArthur, federal troops used tear gas, tanks, and bayonets to violently clear the encampment.
MacArthur, he's not going to be a president, may have been able to run, at the time. There was a lot of popularity around MacArthur. I was going to bring him up because he's another one of those guys that I feel like his legacy is getting worse as time goes on. Basically how he handled his involvement in World War II. But you saw higher ups did not like him very much, even from FDR through to Truman. Gets fired, of course, as well. But yeah, what do you think about his legacy?
And when photographs of assaulted veterans hit the front page of newspapers across America, it was game over. Hoover's legacy was sealed, not as a helper, but as a cold, clueless man who fumbled the way for FDR and turned tanks against our own veterans. No list of terrible.
So, one of the problems also for having a depression this deep at this time in the country, we didn't have a lot of things in place in terms of regulation that can protect this type of enormous steep into a depression. Right? Nothing's protecting banks, oversight of the stock market, and all kinds of different things that we have in place now, which seem like they can really help carry the burden if such a situation was going to happen. Famously around 2008, we had the closest thing to that kind of economic collapse. But again, a lot of things were able to, filter out a lot of that stuff from really hitting much of the population.
Presidents will be complete without the guy who watched the Civil War unfold from the front row and did nothing. An event so devastating, it almost killed the country forever. When James Buchanan took office in 1857, the nation was already tearing at the seams over slavery. He had a choice: take action and lead, or do nothing.
Do you think this, you find him, he's often number one on these lists. But where do you put him with the, presidents leading up to that? You were talking about Pierce, for example, earlier, and Fillmore. Those other guys that were kind of on their way there. Do you think more is put on him because the Civil War is literally about to break out?
Instead, he chose door number 3 and let the Supreme Court handle it, which led to the infamous Dred Scott decision that said Black Americans could never be citizens. And Buchanan celebrated. The debate was over in his mind. He even pressured justice.
So again, just because you were a slave, if you move into a free state, that does not make you not a slave anymore. And you're still not a citizen.
Is behind the scenes to make a sweeping pro-slavery ruling, thinking this would settle the issue once and for all. Spoiler alert, it didn't. Instead, it lit a fire under the North. And 3 years later, Abraham Lincoln, who opposed the expansion of slavery, won the presidency without a single Southern electoral vote. Nice work, Top Hat. The South panicked with no more national.
Do you think that was, for those presidents in the 1840s and 50s, why they tried to toe this line was because they were so concerned about, maybe winning some votes in slave states that they kind of had to do that? Lincoln tried to say all types of things to kind of, comfort some of the slave states, saying, not trying to abolish slavery, right? Just it can't spread. Trying to clarify, didn't even necessarily think that white and black people were equals, which, he had brought up and again in the Lincoln Douglas debates.
National power, Southern states began seceding from the Union before Lincoln took office.
Before he even was inaugurated.
And Buchanan, who is still president, insisted that secession was illegal, but also claimed the federal government had no authority to stop it. Thanks for nothing, dude. By the time Buchanan left office, 7 states were gone. Federal forts had been seized, and America was free-falling into civil war. Buchanan's legacy isn't defined by scandal or one bad law. It's defined by his failure to act when the nation's very survival was at stake. Sheesh. I mean, it couldn't possibly get any worse than that, right? Well,
What do we
believe
got?
it or not, it does.
It's going
Because
higher?
this is the worst president in U.S. history. His name is Warren G. Harding. A man so
You know, it's interesting because you hear Buchanan a lot. Do you guys see Harding at like the top, if that's what they're doing here, the top of the list? By the way, of course, I'm going to want to know your list. Now, I do implore you, when I've covered videos that do this kind of thing, do you have consistent criteria for all of these candidates? Is your analysis consistent? Does it is context a part of your argument? What was going on at the time that these decisions were made or not made? But yeah, let's see what you got down below.
unqualified for the job, he even admits it. Harding once privately said, "I am not fit for this office and should never have been here."
I kind of feel like that's something that you could say just in like a moment of despair of how things are difficult, or maybe you don't like mean it that much. But of course, I mean, you can mean it. And if you do mean it, then if you do believe you are not fit for this job truly, then yeah, you probably aren't. But I feel like someone could also say that, you know, all the time. It might be like me as a teacher. I have a hard day and I'm like, dude, I shouldn't be a teacher or something. You know what I mean? But actually deep down, I'm like, no, I shouldn't. I like it. I want to do it.
He wasn't wrong, because Harding ran on returning America to normalcy. Instead, he delivered the most corrupt administration of all time, stacking his cabinet with the Ohio gang, a crew of poker buddies, party friends, and political cronies who looted the government like a bank robbery. Take the Teapot Dome scandal, where a Secretary of the Interior secretly leased federal oil reserves to private companies in exchange for bribes.
Fraudulent.
Bad? Oh, you bet. But not as bad as the head of the Veterans Bureau, who embezzled millions meant for wounded soldiers. Or his Attorney General, who allegedly took kickbacks to look the other way while criminals ran wild during Prohibition.
Sure. Oh my gosh, Prohibition. There was so much corruption going on from every level. Like people high up in the government, they were all consuming alcohol. Police are getting bribed to look the other way. That thing was like always doomed.
While all of this was happening, Harding spent his days golfing, gambling, and drinking, which was illegal during the Prohibition, by the way. He even had multiple affairs while in office. This dude's the worst. Harding even admitted, "I have no trouble with my enemies. I can take care of my enemies in a fight. But my damn friends, they're the ones that keep me walking the floor at nights." It's maybe the guilt started eating away at him, because Warren G.
He's making a good
Harding
case,
died
isn't
of
he?
a heart attack in 1923, mid-scandal, leaving the country shocked.
feel like
at
he's
the
number one?
rot
Has he made a good
inside his
case?
Administration. Harding's presidency didn't just damage trust in government, it shattered it. But hey, maybe that was a good thing, because today we're still skeptical of political corruption, even with it happening in front of our faces. How's that
That's
stock
fair.
portfolio going up? But there you have it. The worst presidents.
That Pelosi. That's the big thing, or one of the next things they'll probably be talked about is, should congressmen basically have stock portfolios? Being so influential in specific companies, when you have investments of companies with legislation and pushing for legislation that can very much affect specific companies, is that a conflict of interest? What do you guys think about that? I don't know what that means. Does that mean if you are going into an election, you have to basically sell all the shares, I guess, of your stock? And then, I don't know, when you leave office, you can buy back into the market again? So yeah, if you do think there should be some laws about preventing that type of stock ownership, what do you think are the ways you can most fairly, I guess, organize that?
In American history. Not only did they stink at their jobs, they nearly broke the country. But if you thought their legacies were dark, wait until you hear how they died. One choked on cherries. Another dropped dead from a stroke.
So this video I reacted to yesterday, I'll also link that down below because that was the first video I had seen. I think that might have been the first video they ever made. And I think the one we're watching right now was the second. So if you guys want me to keep watching these videos, please let me know. Best way to know for me to know is to like this video. That'll definitely know if I have a really, good high amount of that. I know you want to see more of this channel. And of course, let me know down in the comments. But here are my final thoughts. So who do you think they missed? We saw the kind of classic list of them. I think just kind of reorganized in a certain way. You saw different political parties that were represented here. Although we know platforms of political parties change and have done so over the decades and centuries of our country. But let's see your lists down below. Before you forget, sub to Mr. Terry Originals down below, doing a big grand opening of the channel, which just launched this past week and putting out a bunch of content every day. Would love to see your support over there. We'll see you next time. Bye.